Hey, so I'm going to talk about some famous pseudo-intellectual crackpots slash evolutionary biologists slash Trump sycophants who I love to make fun of, Bret Weinstein and Heather Hang. And they're going to talk about RFK and beef tallow. Everyone knows, of course, RFK, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., famous pseudo-intellectual crackpot and anti-vaxxer who has now become a Trump sycophant as well. So I'm going to show how bad they are at evaluating evidence and so on and so forth. So here we go.
I did want to talk a little bit about the Atlantic's attack on tallow this week, which is it's incredible. It's so laughable. So I guess I'm still surprised at the vigor and the venom with which they're going after Kennedy. It is shocking to me. So, again, in the vein of like big food, big pharma, big ag, like they're all the enemy. And sometimes they're in cahoots. And
Yeah, you say poisoning the well? Literally said, they're all the enemy and they're literally in cahoots. Like, there's no possible way that they can sound good regardless of what they're talking about in terms of these evil organizations now. And I agree with a lot of what they say about nutrition in terms of saturated fat and shit, but they're just terrible at evaluating evidence and making arguments. Press the wrong thing.
and sometimes they're not. We talked about Bovier last week, the methane-reducing food additive for cows. And many months ago, we talked about Appeal, the food grade coating that gets put on, that can be put and has been put on.
The main aspect in all of this nutrition shit that they talk about for me is I used to be a food Nazi too, but you can like if you're eating fruits and vegetables and meat and stuff, it's still gonna be healthier than like buying shit from McDonald's or ordering shit with skip the dishes or whatever the American one is every day. That's like if you eat apples, even if they have like bad unhealthy shit on skin. It's not like apples are gonna kill you. Just eat an apple. It's better than eating a McDonald's cheeseburger.
On produce, including sometimes organic produce, which reduces gas exchange between the outside and the inside of the fruit, and therefore allows them to be stable for transit for longer. But it also means that you can't rely on your senses to tell you how fresh a piece of fruit is. There are many examples of
Except you can though, because when you take them home from the grocery store, they'll still go bad, and you don't eat them if they go bad. Duh.
newfangled technologies that solve one little problem that the market has identified. In the case of Appeal, how do we keep fruit for fresh for longer so that the fact that our long supply chain doesn't get in the way of making a profit, and also people in North America want peaches in January, right? And so it is our demand for it, or the problem has been in part created by a description of something real wherein carbon is the thing that needs to get reduced. And so that's where we have Bovier and the other methane reducing food additives for cows. But into that insane mix, we now have the Atlantic this week talking about tallow. America stopped cooking with tallow for a reason. Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s view on fats is about bucking convention, not promoting health. And so let's
That's
just start
actually
with that
true.
subtitle, which again, the author may not have anything to do with the title, the subtitle, but I've seen this critique before. It's, oh, he's just a contrarian. And we've been called just contrarians. And it's one of actually the most insipid and wrong and ridiculous contentions that actual scientists can be
No, it's true.
slapped with, because if that's all you're doing, you're going to be wrong a fair amount of time. And so your predictive power, if you're just faithful or you're just a contrarian, a true believer or a contrarian, is not going to be getting better over time. Whereas if you are saying, actually, here's why I think this is true, you're likely to have predictive power. So the idea that Kennedy
No, because like you can a lot of people who are experts in their fields actually have better predictive power than random people having contrarian opinions for having the sake of contrarian opinions are. They contrarians can be right, but most of the time throughout human history, the contrarians are wrong.
Is just a contrarian is based in no fact at all, but it's an easy thing to accuse someone of.
I would also point out, if you look at any of the places where Kennedy is present for this accusation, he always pushes back and he says,
No.
show me any case where the evidence is not supporting my position. The person, of course, fumbles. Sometimes they come up with something.
Yeah.
And then what you get is an encyclopedic response from Kennedy, where he's looked at this countervailing argument, and here is why he doesn't believe it. And so that is not the hallmark of a simple contrarian.
No, because like no one actually fucking reads scientific studies. The people who believe people like Bret Weinstein and Heather Hang, if they did, they would see that there are no such thing as peer-reviewed peer-reviewed and replicated scientific studies, or even meta-analyses of peer-reviewed and replicated scientific studies on, like, for example, the effectiveness of ivermectin alone on specifically preventing COVID. That there's no such thing as evidence that bears that out, et cetera, et cetera. You show that they don't. You can see that they don't actually even read the papers they actually cite. In part of this clip that I'm going to show a little later of him talking with Robert Wright about his conspiracies to do with military readiness and COVID, you can see that he doesn't even read the abstract for his own article that he cites. I don't show that in this clip, but watch the entire long debate for that. It's very useful to know. And I don't know what I'm doing here. There we go.
That is the hallmark of somebody who has evaluated all the evidence, and for whatever reasons that have a lot to do with this, the actual highest quality analysis is not the one that you are hearing from the institutions.
Right.
Which would look like contrarianism, but it ain't.
Well, and in fact...
oh, shit, that's not what I meant to do. See Daisy. Well, I'm going to go to this next clip here now while I load up that one, because it shows you what he says about conspiracy hypotheses versus conspiracy theories. Oh, wait, I didn't screen share that one. Let me screen share that one. This one.
Recognition that collusion is not uncommon, and therefore the simple fact of wondering whether it has taken place is not evidence of a mental defect. So collusion is natural. But the second thing to realize is that when collusion happens, it automatically comes with an attempt to disguise itself. And therefore, the normal tools that we would use to detect what the nature of some pattern we are looking at is and what its cause might be, those tools are often not functional, because those who have colluded will have organized evidence so that we will reach a wrong conclusion and fail to see their role.
It's a conspiracy.
So, in effect, Occam's razor, although it would work if we had all of the information, is gamed by those who would collude. But I would argue that actually the biggest, the most important tool at our disposal is simply the scientific method, and the recognition that the term conspiracy theory itself is a weapon used to dismiss those who wonder about the explanations for certain events.
If you call someone a conspiracy theorist, that means they're just actually telling the truth, and they're using dangerous truth and dangerous speech, so you have to shut them down because they're right.
And there is no reason that we should be using conspiracy theory, because the word theory means a hypothesis that has withstood test. It is not the notion that something may have taken place. The notion that something may have taken place, if it is testable, is a hypothesis inherently. And so what I do...
So conspiracy hypothesis is, according to his own logic, even less sensical than a conspiracy theory, because it's a theory that has not been tested.
is I use the term conspiracy hypothesis. And what that means when I
I'm a conspiracy hypothesizer.
say conspiracy hypothesis rather than conspiracy theory, what I'm intending to imply is that the toolkit that one uses to evaluate these different explanations is well understood to us. There are shelves in your college libraries dedicated to the philosophy of science, and that is to say, the rules of engagement for evaluating competing hypotheses. To put something in this modality to describe
He knows nothing about the philosophy of science. He doesn't even realize that his philosophy of science is actually a particular philosophy which has been argued about and agreed and disagreed with about by scientists for at least hundreds of years, if not thousands of years.
something as a conspiracy hypothesis is to invoke the standards by which it is to be properly judged. And it is also to say that the fact that one considers a given explanation does not rule out the consideration of others. A person can simultaneously entertain multiple hypotheses. In fact, that is what science invites us to do. So I would suggest that all who are interested in looking at explanations for events, some of which are straightforward and some of which may be nefarious, you should sign up for the scientific toolkit. And that means that you are obligated to its standards rather than leaping to the last page and
Conspiracy hypotheses are just scientific method in action, bro.
assuming that you've diagnosed the problem and falsely granting the notion the label theory.
So far, so good.
Okay, that's just an Australian politician. He's not important for the purpose of this. So gonna share the Weinstein and Hang one again here. We'll go back to that. And here it is.
The hallmark of a simple contrarian. That is the hallmark of somebody who has evaluated all the evidence, and for whatever reason, reasons that have a lot to do with this, the actual highest quality analysis is not the one that you are hearing from the institutions.
Oh, look at that graph. Conspiracy theorists or conspiracy hypothesizers are experts in making very, very sloppy graphs with no evidence behind them.
Which would look like contrarianism, but it ain't.
Well, and in fact,
It actually is, though.
what the Atlantic is doing here is reinforcing the status quo and being knee-jerk negative about anything that Kennedy says. So we have here Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s latest spin on MAGA, make frying oil tallow again, is surprisingly straightforward for a man who has spent decades downplaying his most controversial opinions. All right, that sentence is just insane. Last month, Kennedy argued in an Instagram post that Americans were healthier when restaurants such as McDonald's cooked fries in beef tallow, that is cow fat, instead of seed oils, a catch-all term for common vegetable-derived oils, including corn, canola, and sunflower. We've talked about seed oils recently on Dark Horse.
RFK has also been going around making this totally false claim that in countries other than America, McDonald's fries their fries their fries not in seed oils, but in beef tallow. It takes 30 seconds or like 5 minutes at the most to do a quick cursory examination of this, and you find that this stopped happening anywhere in the world in 1985. He says that, McDonald's in Canada and Mexico, I think it was, for example, fry fries in beef tallow. That's not true. I live in Canada. That doesn't happen. McDonald's isn't like healthier because they fry fries in beef tallow. They fry them in canola oil, like in basically every other fucking country.
In his view, no. Americans, he wrote, are being unknowingly poisoned by seed oils. In his view, we'd all be better off cooking with solid fats such as tallow, butter, and lard. In a video that Kennedy posted on Thanksgiving, he deep fries.
Like I said earlier, I agree, but they're just bad at evaluating evidence and coming up with arguments because, like, you can see how obviously wrong they are if you take like 5 minutes to look up anything they say.
As a whole turkey in beef tallow and says, this is how we cook the Maha way. I've just highlighted in the next paragraph some of the ways that this author is making her arguments. Conventional medical guidance, in contrast to a fringe theory. Most nutrition scientists squarely dismiss this idea as a conspiracy theory, as if science is a democracy, which it's not. What is true regardless of whether
That's just a stupid statement, especially for someone who's supposedly a scientist. Science isn't exactly a democracy, but it's not as if like fringe theories are usually more likely to be correct than the majority opinion. Yeah, like the example that people always use is all scientists or not all scientists, but most scientists used to believe that the Earth is flat. Turned out to be the case that that's wrong. But most of the time throughout human history, experts, the majority of experts in their field are correct about whatever relevant information is in their field. It's actually way less likely for some contrarian with a fringe opinion to be correct than it is for the majority of scientists in a particular field to be incorrect. They're evaluating evidence in the completely opposite way of the way that you should evaluate evidence.
or not the majority believes it. And this is the mistake that many in journalism are making, and convincing hapless members of the population into believing as well. If only a few people believe a thing, it must be wrong because science says.
No, they most likely are wrong because the majority of scientists in that particular field think that they are wrong. Like, for someone who appears to be so smart, these are just fucking specious arguments, and they cloak their dumb opinions in pseudo-intellectuals language so that they can sound smart, but they're actually saying super fucking dumb shit.
And no, it's not science says, it's Simon says, as you have said recently.
It is
No, there's Simon.
Simon says, but I would remind people that every great idea, the stuff that becomes the bedrock of science, starts as a minority of one. So if you have the naive notion that, either a consensus or the majority tells you what's true, then the point is progress is over. You are taking the thing which allows.
No, it tells you what is way more likely to be true than a fringe conspiratorial contrarian opinion.
Us to overcome the places where we are confused, and you are ruling it out going forward. But if you go back to that sentence,
What in full
Just,
screen is?
it's not on your screen here, but it said something like most nutrition scientists dismiss it as a conspiracy theory.
Exactly.
That's an entirely logical and truthful statement.
Yeah, here it is.
What that describes something this author could not possibly know. First of all, what does it mean?
Actually, that is something you know. That's not even fucking true. I don't even believe he's telling the truth about that. He knows that there are scientific studies, and you can look at scientific studies, and a scientist can evaluate the majority of scientific studies on a particular subject. Even a journalist can do that and see what the majority of studies are that the majority of scientists believe. This is possible to know. He's saying it's impossible to fucking know.
Most nutrition scientists squarely dismiss this idea as a conspiracy theory. Where is that recorded? Right?
Well,
the viewpoint of
it's recorded that most scientists in this particular field believe this to be false, which it means that it most likely is false. It doesn't have to be, there don't have to be scientific studies to show that it's a conspiracy theory in order for science to have basically proven that, like, disproven their theories.
A majority of nutrition scientists, if you think about what Heather and I were talking about at the beginning of the podcast, you've got a system in which somebody who came through the system and said, you know what, this is actually not true. Seed oils are dangerous because of the extraction methodology and the impurities that are left in the oil that is produced. Somebody like that would not likely survive to get into the category you're talking about. nutrition scientists, right?
Mhm.
They would leave because they would
No, like becoming a nutrition scientist is not, it is not like politicized. Maybe there's some aspects of the science of nutrition that are somewhat politicized, but it's not as if you decide to become a nutritionist, you're not going to be allowed if you don't have the right political opinions on food.
not find any support in the system for their heterodox perspective, which would then leave you some
Heterodox used to mean alternative but interesting and reasonable opinions. It now just means conspiracy theories.
majority that, yes, had reached some kind of agreement, but as the result of the fact that you threw out the people who didn't agree with it. But beyond that, it's one thing to say this is not the mainstream view within the current academy on this question of nutrition. It is another thing to claim that you know what it is that the majority of nutrition scientists would say about this. Conspiracy theory is an accusation.
You can evaluate what they do say about this. You can know this. Like, it's fucking stupid to say that you can't know this.
You are putting into the mouths of the majority of nutrition scientists
No, you're
a
not.
specific accusation about why they don't believe something and other people do. And the
No,
point
it's
is, you
called
just made that
evidence.
up.
Yeah.
No, that's actually what he does all the time. So I'm going to show you another clip here with him and Robert Wright. It's a clip from a few years ago, but it shows you how he evaluates evidence and makes arguments and makes this fucking wacko conspiratorial argument about COVID with no evidence behind it. So I'll show you that clip here. And then we're going to go back to the original clip for a few minutes to finish that one out here. And this one. And for those of you who don't know, Robert Wright is, I like him. He writes a lot of different books. He wrote Non-Zero, I think it's called. No, wait, no, not Non-Zero. He has the term Non-Zero. And one of his books I really like is Why Buddhism is True. Another one I really like is The Evolution of God, which talks about the way that the Christian God, the way that the view of him changed throughout the beginning of Christianity. That one's really interesting too. And yeah, so he's way better at evaluating evidence and has not become a pseudo-intellectual conspiratorial crackpot, let alone a Trump sycophant, as Bret Weinstein has become. So let's look at this one.
The policies that are so devastating here are being advanced most aggressively by what I call the blue team, the Democratic Party, of which I've been a lifelong member, but I can't even recognize that party now. So if you were interested
Oh, so he's reading a tweet of Bret Weinstein's here.
in keeping that party in power so that it could continue to advance bad policy, but you were also interested in degrading military readiness, then the mandates might persist in the military while they were withdrawn in advance of midterm elections or something like that in the civilian population. I hear myself saying that, and I know how it sounds. On the other hand, I'm a scientist. What I do is I look at patterns and I eliminate potential explanations based on the fact that they don't fit until we're down to a small number of explanations that might underlie.
Conspiracy theories are entirely reasonable because you can rule out all other reasonable explanations, which means like the conspiracy hypothesis is far most likely to be true.
The pattern. And in this case, that is a very unfortunate process that I think ought to alarm every American. So you seem to think this is the most parsimonious explanation or close to that. A few other things you said in the course of the same podcast. Has something gotten into our system that is unhooking our readiness because it doesn't want us ready? Here's another thing. It's hard to explain that pattern by anything other than some form of sabotage. Here's another thing. We're looking at something that behaves like enemy action. Now, I submit that anyone who listens to this podcast and is already inclined to not be big fans of the Biden administration, specifically with respect to this issue, and I suspect that description fits a fair number of people in your audience, could take you as suggesting that, in fact, there is a conspiracy in the executive branch to undermine our military readiness. You don't think so?
I know exactly what error you're making.
What is it called?
Let me ask you a question.
He doesn't answer
Do you
questions.
believe that our system has a problem with corruption?
Most systems have some kind of problem with corruption.
I would agree. I'm a fan of there was were you a fan of The Wire?
I didn't watch it, no.
It was excellent. And there was a particular scene in which an individual involved in city government was talking to another individual walking down the street, and their point was, you have to expect to
An individual was talking to another individual. I sound very smart with how articulate and intelligent my dialogue is.
certain amount of corruption, but the level of corruption has become obscene. And that is where we are. I do not expect a system without any corruption. But the level of corruption in our system, I would argue, is utterly obscene. Would you, does that sound like a crazy position to you so far?
Well, you'd have to define terms. My main point is that there are other explanations for the phenomenon you're describing.
I mean, that's possibly accurate, but utterly obscene in comparison to what? In comparison to what country? In comparison to what alternative of the way America could be organized and who could be leading it and that sort of shit. That's, like he's pointing out there, that's incredibly vague.
Okay, no,
that are much less incendiary and actually more plausible.
Yeah.
You have laid out your case. I
haven't. I haven't gotten to the other explanations.
You have laid out your case that what I'm saying is beyond the pale. Now,
you're not going to let me get to the alternative explanations, Brett? Is this a scientific discussion?
You seem a little defensive, Robert. We are having a conversation. You have said some things. I would like to respond to them because I think you so far haven't even understood what it was that I was putting on the table.
Okay, what were you putting on the table?
Bro, you don't even understand what I was saying, bro. You're not intelligent enough, bro.
I believe we have a problem with obscene levels of corruption in our system. I believe that COVID policy reveals this. Now, if you want a little historical background, I would say that before the Clinton administration, the GOP was the party of business, that it had a business model in which effectively it peddled influence to wealthy, mostly corporations, when those corporations wanted to do something that was not in the interest of the public, right? And there's a natural tension between these things. You tend to pay in order to influence things when what you're doing is not in the interest of those who are being governed, because you wouldn't have to pay if it was. We would just simply do it. That's what corruption is. Now, the Clinton administration, I believe, changed the Democratic Party. That what it did was it took up the GOP's business plan and it abandoned the public and started serving different corporate interests. And we effectively ended up with two corporate parties and nobody representing the public. And so these parties both pay attention to the public periodically when they have to because there's an election.
So why did you go all Trump sycophant MAGA then if both parties are the same way in that sense?
But by and large, what they exist for is to serve the interests of wealthy donors at the expense of the interests of the public. That's what they do 365 days a year. Okay. Now, the problem is that once you have a system that is informally about corruption, there are no good safeguards for preventing things that you don't anticipate from getting into that system. And so what I was suggesting was not...
So the system is corrupt, which means conspiracy can happen. Therefore, his particular conspiracy theory, that's very wild and way more specific than the vague guidelines he's saying here. That specific conspiracy theory is true because it's possible. That's what he's saying.
That Joe Biden or anyone else in the executive branch is actively interested in harming the country, but that something has purchased influence that might be.
What do you think that thing is?
Well, I don't know.
If it's not, I mean, but a limited number of people can sway our vaccine policy in the military. So either they are unwitting dupes of something, and I'm waiting to hear what you think that is, or they are intentionally implementing this policy. And I venture to say, by the way, that based on the things you said, the average naive listener would think you're suggesting, on the basis of these quotes, that there are actually conspirators in the executive branch. But if not, what scenario do you have in mind about how they become unwitting dupes and who is pulling the strings and how.
Well, let me ask you a question. I mean, it seems to
Why
me.
don't you ever answer my questions? And
It never does.
What is the answer to that question? What do you have in mind?
First of all, Robert, there is a reason that I phrased this as a hypothesis. Now, the fact of it being a hypothesis does not mean I do or do not believe that it is the explanation. It means that it is a proposal for something that might explain a pattern, something that makes predictions, and that it deserves to be on the table of potential explanations. Okay. Now, it happens that I do think that this one is plausible, but you do not have, logically speaking, you don't have the right.
So he said that a hypothesis, being a hypothesis, doesn't tell you necessarily that it's any more likely to be true than any other hypothesis. However, he's saying he likes this hypothesis the most, and it's the most likely to be true, even though he has no evidence for this particular conspiratorial hypothesis. He's just saying conspiracies and corruption are possible and happen in some way, shape, or form. Therefore, my particular conspiracy theory about I think his specific claim, once they actually eventually get into it, is that the Chinese government has conspired with the Biden government to institute the opposite of would be good advice for vaccine policies in order to decrease military readiness. That's a very extremely specific conspiracy theory / conspiracy hypothesis, which he does not prove or offer evidence for in any way, shape, or form.
To try to get me to fill out the picture of how this corruption might work, I don't know.
You don't have to state what your hypothesis is.
So he thinks that he has this conspiracy hypothesis, but he doesn't even actually have it fully fledged out. He doesn't know any of the details about it. He doesn't know how this conspiracy theory would happen. He doesn't know who would be involved, what would they do, how this could happen, why he thinks it's reasonable or plausible, how plausible it is in comparison to other theories, why he thinks this one is more plausible in comparison to other theories. He's supposed to be a scientific thinker. He's fucking terrible at evaluating evidence and making arguments.
I took it to be that there's somebody in the executive branch corrupting our policy intentionally. You're saying, no, I didn't mean that. Well, then what did you mean? What is your hypothesis?
Let me then look, we're going to get to the approximate answer to your question.
In 10 years.
Do you think we have enemies who would consider attacking us militarily?
Sure.
Okay. Do you think we have enemies that would contemplate sabotage against us rather than attacking us militarily?
Sure.
Do you think they have noticed that we have a pay-for-play political system? And do you think they have contemplated paying to get us to do things that they would have a hard time doing from the outside?
Well, I know for a fact that foreign interests, as well as a number of domestic special interests that are also corrupting, make donations to politicians. They also try to influence think tanks. Okay. There's a lot of corruption of clear thinking out there. Sure.
Then what are we disagreeing about?
I just want to hear what you're
because you're saying these general things in terms of corruption and conspiracy sometimes happen. Governments can be corrupted. Therefore, your very specific conspiracy theory about the Chinese government corrupting Biden's government with bad COVID policies to reduce American military readiness. That's why you're fucking wrong, dude.
Actual hypothesis is you told me I was wrong. You are not even suggesting that Joe Biden or anyone in the administration is intentionally undermining our military readiness. So, okay, who is and how are they pulling these strings? Because it's not that easy to manipulate a policy like this. So what do you have in mind?
Again, I'm not sure why you feel entitled to demand of me particulars that I, of course, have no way.
Why do you have the right to demand of me the particulars of my hypothesis that I think is most likely to be true and more plausible than any other explanation? Why do you demand that I support my argument and defend it?
Of knowing. The question is, are there powers out there that have a large quantity of financial capacity who might have noticed that we have a system in which you can pay for play, who might be feeding something into it that isn't good for us? And that the people who are going along with this are not actively interested in harming us, but they don't give a shit about us. That's why they're in this pay for play system.
They don't give a shit, therefore they have all these nefarious intentions, and Biden's government is conspiring with the Chinese government to institute bad vaccine policies in order to reduce American military readiness.
System.
You mean they're American actors who don't want to harm us but don't give a shit, so they're being bribed or something?
Look, you know, I was
Doesn't say what he means.
Attacked for simply paying attention to the Hunter Biden laptop story.
All right, we don't need to get into all this, but I'll go back and finish off the main clip here. Don't worry, we'll get to the meat lotion. I know you were waiting, riveted with excitement over the meat lotion. So don't worry, we're gonna get into that here.
I guess I find that the least of my complaints about this piece, because I actually, having now gone into a number of these papers that are written by so-called nutrition scientists, they don't have a lot of thinking. They are not evidencing thinking, and
when I've shown you multiple times here how they are not actually evidencing thinking or being very good at evaluating evidence or making arguments.
And many of them are cited in places like The Atlantic and the New York Times, and they just talk about authority. They just talk about, well, if the FDA approved it, I'm sure it's safe, right? It's
so do you. You just talk about authority in the opposite direction. You think authority says this, therefore they're wrong, because I like to be contrarian, even though like the system or whatever you want to call it is usually more likely to be correct than incorrect if we're talking about the majority of scientific particular opinion on a subject in their particular field of study.
Those sorts of claims. Again, a complete reversal of conventional health beliefs.
No.
And you know, this article just is totally insane. The research has continued to bear out the dangers of saturated fats. This is one of very few supposedly scientific articles actually cited here by the Atlantic.
Again, I kind of disagree with that claim about saturated fat too, but it's not insane.
And what it links to is a review in the journal Circulation in 2017 called Dietary Fats and Cardiovascular Disease, a presidential advisory from the American Heart Association.
The American
Heart Association, bad because they're an evil government organization.
This is from the leadership at the American Heart Association, which when you click through to them, incidentally, you find that right now, 24 hours only, you can make an 8 times life-saving impact with your donation. That strikes me as really familiar.
Yeah.
Isn't that bizarre?
That's
the
same Kamala Harris.
Oh, you mean they want money just like you? Oh no, people want money for their work.
Election playbook.
Yeah. So, I don't know what necessarily that to make of that. They're using as evidence the Atlantic article that this
references
presidential advisory for the American Heart Association, which
references a study which you clearly did not examine or actually read. I'd be willing to bet a large sum of money that you didn't go anywhere beyond, read anything beyond the abstract, because, well, at least if she evaluates evidence in the same way as Bret Weinstein does, because we know that he didn't do that with his debate with Robert Wright, and it seems like she is just as terrible at evaluating evidence and making arguments.
Seems to have scrubbed its site of exactly how it was formed. It's celebrating 150 years, I think now. Or maybe it's 100, I can't remember. I guess it's 100. And they do have some of their financial reportings on their site, and they're not getting that much of their funding from actual pharmaceutical companies, but the vast majority of their funding is from...
So they're not evil, but I'm trying to search for ways in which they're evil.
Non-specified, non-corporate donors. And I feel like that's where the bodies are buried. I don't
Oh
know. I
yeah,
don't know what
bodies
all
are
is there, but
literally said that's where the bodies are buried.
just one more thing from this tallow article. This article.
Well, wait. The American Heart Association, if I remember correctly.
Well, I'm saying that I couldn't find the claim that you're about to make. I cannot establish the claim that you're about to make.
So she knows that he has no evidence behind his claim. Seems like he obviously has not examined evidence for his claim, because she has looked up evidence with a cursory examination and disproved his theory.
The American Heart Association was founded
as a trade group that effectively was pushing seed oils.
And what I'm saying is
you don't find that on their site.
So that conspiratorial claim is actually not true.
I don't find it elsewhere with a relatively quick look. So I have seen that claim. I've heard you make that claim. There is nothing easy to find about the origins.
Could be.
So she's going through, the author is going through.
That sounds like Jordan Peterson making the claim that I think, in my opinion, as far as I know, as far as I can tell, hospitals do more harm than good. Now, I could be wrong about that, but I could also not be wrong.
Through why you should want animal fats. The first question is the validity of the research that established the harms of saturated fats, right? As if margarine is good for you and anyone thinks that is the case. Second category alleges the harm of seed oil. Saturated fats, which is the harm. Questions the harms of saturated fats. These are the claims that people like us are making, that butter and lard and tallow are actually good for you, in part based on really basic evolution.
I'm not sure if it's that simple. I think it's more complex than that.
Analysis that's what humans were eating all along.
Humans were eating butter all along? Paleolithic people were eating butter? No? Like, they didn't have the... They didn't figure out how to make butter. You have to like churn butter and shit like that. That didn't happen like 10,000 years ago, man. And also, it's just a dumb argument to say, evolutionarily speaking, we know that people ate this way, therefore we know people should eat this way. There is some validity to that, but you can eat new things. The evolution is adaptation, so you can adapt, and maybe that's true, that saturated fats can be healthy, but not necessarily in excessive amounts, which is the same case with anything. And it's not as if you can say evolutionarily people ate this in the past, therefore we should eat this. They also ate like fucking raw vegetables that they pulled out of the ground. I bet you are not advocating for people to pull raw vegetables out of the ground and eat them.
And didn't have the number of cardiovascular events that they have now. Secondly, the harms of seed oil.
I don't know about that.
Saturated fats. And then third, which is perhaps the most puzzling, she says, comprises a bona fide enthusiasm for tallow. Americans aren't just eating beef tallow, they're also smearing it on their faces as a supposedly natural alternative to conventional moisturizer, despite a lack of scientific evidence and sometimes the faint smell of cow.
Wait.
Ooh, cow lotion.
Supposedly natural. What's supposed about it?
So what I did not have time to do today was go and find some of the moisturizers that presumably women like authors of this piece are using. And I don't actually even know what those might be, but some of these sort of elite expensive beauty brands, right? And just look at the list of ingredients, which are not going to be supposedly natural. They're going to be explicitly and undeniably unnatural, from a lab, synthesized from things like petroleum products. And what they're trying to do here is use disgust to sway you.
That's true.
You don't want to smell like a cow. You don't want to put beef fat on your face. Isn't that a little gross? I actually find it much more gross to put the refined oils from the petroleum industry on your face. And also surprising that you don't think that might have long-term negative health benefits.
So,
yeah. Spread that meat lotion all over their faces. Yeah, she wants that meat dragged all over her face. Drag that meat, smear the meat all over their faces so they just drown in the meat lotion.